The session. It's called Climate Change, the Big Challenge. How would emerging economies finance their transition to net zero? So just to give you a context for all of this, you see that the world economy is slowing down. You see that private investment is weakening. You see that countries have emerged COVID after that they have emerged COVID with a whole lot more public debt than they had before. And you see the slowest recovery in trade, in global trade, for the last 50 years, right? But these are minor problems for somebody like Montek, because when he took over the Indian economy, it had all of these problems and more. So he's going to tell us how to do all of these things, how to fix all of these things, but also do climate change, to actually find a way to get to net zero, to find a way despite all of these things. When he speaks, he'll take as long as he wants, because there's no way that I can interrupt him. But once he's done, we'll have 4 speakers. We'll start with Ingrid Hoven, who is the managing director of the German Development Agency. And what's notable about the German Development Agency, about the Germans thing, they're pretty much the only ones who brought real money to the problem, just so you know. So she has the right to be here. The second one is Nick Stern, who, those of you who don't know, he was the chief economist of the World Bank, but that you would know, right? But what you don't know, perhaps, is that I think he was the most influential chief economist of the World Bank, because he was very, very focused about what he wanted the World Bank to start paying attention to, which was both empowerment of people as well as improvement of the investment climate. Okay? And he just repeated that until we all got it. Okay? Then after that, we have Rima, who I'm really glad she's here, because she's probably the only one who's actually prepared very well for this. And the last one is my former colleague, Hasan Tuluy, who was actually one of my favorite colleagues at the World Bank. He was a vice president of many things. I think the low point of his career was when he was vice president of HR. But I think that that was a long time ago. I guess he needed the money and that kind of a thing. Okay, so I'm going to stop speaking, Montek, and it's your mic.
Well, thank you very much, Indermit. Great pleasure to be here, and I thank the EMF for inviting me to speak at this session. And I'm a bit sort of overwhelmed, because this is such a distinguished forum that I have this feeling that all I'm doing is interrupting you from hearing them. The most sensible thing for me to do would be to put out a whole lot of propositions which would, in a sense, challenge them to respond. But before that, I was very struck by the comments of the preceding speaker, who mentioned the distinction between analysis and narrative. I'm personally actually very convinced that we need a lot more narrative brought into the discussion. I mean, maybe the result of, currently I'm reading Schindler's book, Economic Narratives, and it's really I recommend it to all of you, because if you want to put the usual discussion of economic policy into a framework in which narratives are really what drive the choice of analysis, it's a terrific book. And I think if you look at climate change, that is really very, very important, to be able to relate the discussions that we're having all the time with the underlying narrative. Having said that, I also regret that I am unable to follow in the wonderful example of Watanabe-san, who produced an extraordinary collection of cartoons. You know, one of the things about climate change is that it hasn't really produced some interesting cartoons. It's produced this sort of scary cartoons, but I wish I had thought about putting across 10 cartoons which would lay out the framework within which all these discussions should take place. Well, I'm sorry that I didn't. Now, I'd like to just sort of a little bit, my view is that the discussions on climate change have been going on since 1992. I mean, that's when the Rio conference happened. So when you think about it, that's 30 years. And in this 30-year period, I mean, take another step back, the Bretton Woods conference triggered an incredible burst of institutional activity. But then, as somebody pointed out, that was after 2 world wars and so many people dead, etc. But otherwise, for 30 years, I mean, have we really got anywhere? That's really the question that we should address. We are now heading into COP28. And the question is, will it make progress? Now, if you go back a little on the history, the first and the most important thing for which everybody is responsible is that the developing countries were consistently encouraged to believe that they don't have to take on any obligations. That is actually a wonderful position, because then you're just demanding, you're not doing anything. And naturally, the developing countries said, that's terrific. That is the basis on which the so-called Kyoto Protocol was formulated. Only the advanced countries would make commitments. We don't have to make any commitments. Actually, they did agree that, we can make commitments voluntarily. And for those voluntary commitments, there would be some financial assistance provided, but no clarity on how that would be decided or anything. Now, jumping several years, the Kyoto Protocol, of course, failed, and not surprisingly, because over time, the developing countries had become much more important. China was still being regarded as a developing country, although it had become the principal polluter in the world, so obviously this wasn't going to work. And in 2009, at the time of the Copenhagen COP, there was an accord reached between a few countries and the developed countries led by the US, that the developing countries will make some efforts at mitigation, more or less aimed at reducing not total emissions, but emissions intensity of GDP, and that the developed countries would provide additional funding, $100 billion per year, to be reached by 2020. Well, this was enshrined into the 2015 COP21 in Paris. And of course, during this period, it became very clear that the global warming process is pretty much out of control and things are getting worse and worse. I think the Secretary General, referring not to global warming, but to global boiling, is an example of that. So by the time COP26 happened, I think the developing countries worked out that the principle of accepting very limited obligations is not actually acceptable. And all of them chose to endorse the idea of getting to net zero by different points in the mid-century. India offered net zero in 2070, China in 2060, and others around there. Now, that was a complete transformation of the level of commitment that developing countries were accepting from what had been discussed thus far. But COP26 only repeated the proposition that we haven't yet got to the 100 billion we promised, and so let's try to do that by 2024. And it recognized that more is needed and left it to subsequent COPs. Now, this is the important issue, that for the first time, we're faced with having to address the question. Developing countries have now committed to a certain transition, and we need to find out how much money we need for that. Even that description of the situation is seriously flawed, because there's nothing in COP26 that indicates what's the time path of the transition. Now, the fact is that the problem is caused by the fact that countries are adding to CO2, GHG rather, emissions, for every year that they don't reach zero. But lots of countries are very pleased and being complimented also at reaching net zero by some date. without specifying the time path. Now, conceptually, let's only comment on India, but the problem exists for everyone. India says 0 for 2070. Now, technically, we would be fully compliant if we were to remain at the present level of emissions, even increase them, and then sharply come down by 2070. Actually, the damage we do is the area under the curve. It's not when you get to net zero. So if you ask me, and this is my first provocative proposition, the COP20, whatever, multiple numbers negotiations have been fundamentally flawed by not addressing the question, what is the additional CO2 GHG emissions you are now going to produce until you reach net zero? And quite frankly, if you look at what has been committed, we know that if all countries achieve what has been committed, we're not going to be stopping at 1.5 degrees. We're going to be way above it. And therefore, the commitments so far are not adequate. And that, by the way, assumes a sort of linear decline. In terms of what they've committed, they can actually do much worse because they're only committed to an end point. So this is a fundamental problem that in order to work out what you have to do, we should be able to trace the trajectory. Most countries in their minds have some trajectory, but it's not part of the negotiations. Now, coming to financial assistance, it's quite clear. And the COP26, the Glasgow Declaration says so, that this 100 billion, we haven't been doing it and we should do it as quickly as possible, but it's nowhere near enough. And it's left to subsequent COPs in order to work out what should be the commitment. Now, one good advantage this time around is that COP28 has the advantage of an excellent paper by Nick Stern and Vera Songwe and their colleagues, which actually provides an estimate of what the world needs. Now, there are other estimates also. The IMF got one, the IEA has got one, but they're more or less in the same ballpark. And that ballpark illustrates Janet Yellen's very nice comment. We need trillions, but we are talking about billions. So I won't bore you with the numbers, but let me just offer one set of numbers, which really is from the Stern-Songwe paper, which will be before COP. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to judge whether COP28 endorses what Stern-Songwe say. I hope they do, but we'll find out. And what they say really is that we probably need by 2030 2.4 billion extra for all emerging market countries, excluding China, which is fair enough. Within that, and this is the other very, very important point they make, is that most of this has to be mobilized through domestic efforts. So I think the developing countries have to recognize that now that we have some estimate of what is needed, and that's complex, and I won't go into this, but if somebody wants to clarify it, we can do that. What's before us, and I think this is reasonable, what is before us is that 2/3 of what is estimated will have to be mobilized domestically. It's kind of 1/3 or thereabouts, which could come from international sources. So I think this is an important message that at least developing countries should endorse. Because if you don't even endorse that, then the whole thing is pointless. That 1 trillion, that's really what Janet Yellen talks about when she says we need trillions and we're talking about billions. Where is this 1 trillion from abroad going to come from? Well, here again it's important. The 100 billion was meant to be a combination of private and public flows, though very shrewdly the percentage was never identified. Now, for the first time, we're getting somewhere close to identifying that, and that is, the G20 has got another expert group which has roughly similar numbers, and they come up with the conclusion that out of this 1 trillion to come from abroad, 500 billion has to come from the private sector, both equity and debt, And about 500 billion is supposed to come from public funding, out of which a lot, maybe 350 billion or so, is extra funding from the multilateral development banks. Now, these are huge numbers, and this is where the question comes up. Will the development banks be able to do it or not do it? The G20 is meeting in a couple of days. They will be looking at the experts' report. They'll give us some idea of what they are willing to do. You know, my own prediction is you will not get an absolute endorsement of the scale. But what you will get is some general endorsement that MDBs can do more and should do more, and probably also an endorsement that even within their balance sheet, by optimizing the balance sheet a little bit of innovative guaranteeing being done by member countries who are developed, the multilateral development banks will be able to increase the level of funding that they do over the next few years. And technically, one could argue that after all, this is a long-term target. So even if all that happens is that the political environment is not very conducive to persuading governments to cough up more money, especially since they are burdened with having to bear the cost of the Ukraine war, and now we don't know what the cost of the conflict in Israel-Gaza is going to be and how much assistance is going to be needed there. It's quite possible that people will say that, look, let's talk about capital funding expansion later. Let these multilateral development banks do more, which they can. And the key thing here is everybody expects them to use both their skill and their power, not just to do the traditional lending. I mean, it's not as if they're meant to go and do another $30, $40 billion of traditional World Bank loans. They're meant to leverage the private sector. Now, the numbers in the past are not very encouraging. I think some of the numbers I saw that for every dollar that the World Bank lends, they only leverage 10 cents of private sector money. And we're not now talking about them leverage 3 times more than what they would be lending, or something of that order. So it's a reasonable thing to say, can we give a mandate to the World Bank to demonstrate what would it do in order to leverage private sector money? Now here, this is my second controversial proposition. I think the developing countries will have to accept that this is only going to be possible if there are dramatic policy changes within the countries. Now, I think we've distributed a paper, but I don't think that goes in detail to India. We've been doing some work separately on India, and it's very clear that a structural change of this order in the energy sectors, which means shifting from fossil fuel based production of electricity to renewables and electrifying transport as much as possible. You know, a structural change of this order cannot take place without a change in relative prices unless those changes are sort of moderated by subsidies. Now, many people in India are very thrilled by the incredible amount of subsidies that the United States has put through its inflation, a very curious name, Inflation Reduction Act, but it's really subsidizing sensible green economy things. But you know, the United States is in a position where they can do it. And in a way, it's good for the world that they're doing it. But if we get stuck with the idea that in order to do comparable things, we need comparable subsidies, that is simply not going to be possible. So then the issue comes up, are we willing to see the relative price changes that are needed in order to bring about this transformation? And in a separate paper, we've come to the conclusion that we cannot avoid some form of carbon taxation. We may not actually have the guts to put across a tax, an overt tax on fossil fuels, but we could do sort of a cap and trade type thing, which the Europeans do, cover some of the carbon-intensive industries and effectively put a limit on the emissions they have and then allow trading. Now, the crux of that is that the limits have to be not very loose. It's very easy to have a cap-and-trade system which doesn't hurt anybody. What you're really trying to do is to bring in a cap-and-trade system that will simulate the effect of a reasonable carbon tax building up to some reasonable levels. Now, that is a humongous change in domestic policy. I can certainly, if I were addressing an Indian audience, and I were to ask how many people are in favor of this, there'd be none. So there's a big job that government has to do. And I think it's only when people realize that this money isn't going to come as grant money from abroad that people will actually get down to it. I don't know what the World Bank is going to do in order to leverage private sector investments. But if we are talking about the green production of green power, the biggest thing they have to do is to make the distribution companies financially viable. And one of the main reasons that these are not financially viable is there's political interference in tariff setting. This is not just India's problem. This is true of virtually all developing countries. But what are the changes that the World Bank would recommend in order to change that? Because to my mind, we are very pleased with the fact that we have had a terrific increase in investment in green energy, solar and wind in India. The total capacity has gone up from about 5 gigawatts only 10 years ago to 122 gigawatts in 2022. But the target was 175. And in order to make the transition, this has to go up to 450 billion. So while there are investors capable of investing, there obviously is the capacity to choose projects, at least in India, the capacity to implement. But whether enough people will take the risk that is involved, unless the distribution companies are financially viable, that is a different question altogether. And my guess is that if the membership of COP28 accepts the fact that 2/3, maybe more, the IMF, by the way, says 90% of the stuff has to be private sector, not 2/3, but their number is smaller. If that much has to come from the private sector, you cannot hold governments responsible for non-performance on the private front. If we had a sensible approach to both public funding and private funding, we could hold governments responsible, developed country governments, for doing what they agreed to do on funding of the multilateral development banks. And let's see what they do. The G20 will be looking at this in the next 2 days or so. But if everybody has agreed that 2/3 of the money is going to come from private sector, and private sector just doesn't come in, I don't think we can hold Western governments responsible for non-performance. They will just say, you haven't got a climate in which people are willing to invest. Most private sector guys would want to know that they usually say, look, we're very happy to fund all projects which are, as they put it, in the money. And if these projects are not in the money, then it's not going to happen. Well, I know that we were late, and I suspect, I don't have a signal here, but I think it's about time to close. And I just want to say that don't read what I'm saying as a negative assessment. I think we're getting out of the phase in which developing countries were just looking to developed countries and saying, please leave the money on the table as you leave the room. They recognize that they have to do a lot. They're doing quite a lot. Many of our corporates are now engaged in setting up, all kinds of investment for electrolyzers, batteries, green hydrogen, you name it. But all this will only be viable if the underlying financial viability in the market is assured, or if a sufficient subsidy is possible. And I think in that sense, we've got to the second stage of discussion. This is a long-term thing. So we should count on the fact that there is a willingness on the part of governments to do things, but it is also a critical area where everybody agrees that the private sector needs to be leveraged in one way or the other by specific initiatives devised by the multilateral development banks, different from their normal forms of lending. And I think if they can do that, that would be progress. Well, I can see that the chairman is not very subtly hinting that this is the time to sit down. So thank you for letting me speak for that long.
Thank you, Montek. Thank you very much. So I didn't read your assessment as negative. I read it as difficult. You spoke about these 2 or 3 difficult propositions. But we have a really smart panel, so we'll actually try to break this problem down. Starting with the Ingrid. Go ahead, please. It's actually better here because then I can do it.
Perfect. No, first, of course, I would like to thank the EMF and the News House for having me in this gathering, and I would like to underline, actually, with respect to the former session, that we have a long-standing partnership with both institutions, and we did so because we believe, actually, that this type of platforms are absolutely needed in order to deepen understanding about different positions, but also the way ahead and opportunities that one can seize together as countries, as institutions, and certainly, therefore, especially in these times that we are living right now, experiencing right now, more conversation and more these type of gatherings actually are needed so that bridges aren't be lost. Couple of comments with respect to this excellent introduction and also the paper. First one, I found it important that you recognize that still public funding is needed. Because, quite frankly, in my former life, before I joined GIZ, as a member of a German climate delegation and negotiation finance especially, there's sometimes, like the spirit in the room, the private sector can make it all. And this led possibly in some administrations to the thought they don't have to mobilize so much or the fair share that they should mobilize in order to make certain things happening, especially when you think about resilience, climate adaptation. Not all of this is going to be financed by the private sector. We are stepping into new opportunities, they are out there, but it really takes a lot really to reduce risks so that the private sector can get in. Let me remind you that last week in Bonn, the replenishment negotiations of the Green Climate Fund, the central financing instrument of the UNFCCC, has taken place. It took us to about a bit more of 9 billion, the German government, US dollars, the German government pledged 2 of them. And we hope that more countries actually are going to now to make their pledges because, quite frankly, this overall replenishment is smaller than the last one. And our ambition should be bigger. And you are here a powerful group, and I hope that you can also speak to decision makers to make sure that actually the funding is mobilized that is being needed. Second point that I wanted to share with you, it's about not only the mobilization of funding, but how do we make sure that the countries, the communities, the people who are in need really get access to funding. Access to funding is really still an issue. For instance, what can we do? I mean, we are supporting the Green Climate Fund Secretariat in increasing readiness activities so that also smaller institutions in many developing countries can actually start to develop projects and present them to the GCF. This makes actually the spectrum of actors broader. I think this is good also for the narrative, not only for actually efficiency reasons, but also for the narrative, because the more buy-in we have throughout the economies, the better it is really to bring the climate message across. That's my firm belief, and actually we are seeing this in our own home country. Secondly, 1/3 of global emissions are happening at the municipal level. It's amazing, but they have normally really limited access to the normal ODA financing streams. For MDBs, it's very difficult to work directly with municipalities. Therefore, we started in 2017 already to provide specific funding to municipalities in order that they can develop strong projects. First of those kind is the so-called GAP fund that is being implemented by the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, and GIZ together. It starts at the very, very early stage when a municipality has only a project idea, and we take this to a planning stage. And the next level of actually project preparation, we support by a different financing vehicle. Up to now, already in the GAP Fund, we have received more than 300 applications, and 33 of them have been developed, and they are already at the next stage, and they are pretty much in line with getting financing in the near term. The same applies to the next stage, where we're also working together with banks, the AfD, unfortunately not present today, USAID, FCDO, and that stage actually we bring the project development to a feasibility stage. And up to now, this fund is about to mobilize $1 billion, and already 300 million have been secured by the European Investment Bank. And this by very little technical additional funding that comes from the public sphere. Finally, what I wanted to bring across, really look into those stakeholder groups. There are opportunities to seize. I know the big numbers, we need the big numbers to convince policymakers, but we should also seize the small opportunities that are out there. And finally, about private sector mobilization. I would like to share an example from our portfolio in Mexico, because it's about domestic resource mobilization. There we work together with the National Development Bank to create a guarantee fund, which is not a big one, to convince commercial banks really to finance more strongly energy efficiency projects. And this actually guarantee fund has a leverage from 7 million to 240 million that is going to be raised by commercial funds. The same we are doing in Kenya when it comes to e-mobility. Kenya has faced soaring energy prices, so now really turning to e-mobility makes economically sense. But there, the commercial banks, the national banks, they are actually far away for accepting these new approaches. So startups have no entry points so far really to get funding from the national level. And they are looking for investors coming from abroad. So imagine you can really skill those banks that this is a good business, that there are opportunities out there, and we could really unleash a huge potential that is sitting there in those banks in terms of national savings. I would like to conclude with two pleas, Indermit, if you allow me to do so. The first one is actually, I was wondering, because you have made up the calculations, and I think it's really important to bring out the big numbers, especially in the run-up to negotiate the next climate finance goal, and to split it up into responsibility camps, domestically, private sector, publicly. But in times as these, where we have such a high volatility and fragility even in national budgets, where we see pressures to really invest in different areas, wouldn't it be sensible really to think more forcibly about national and global taxes that are actually taxing CO2 and would actually automatically flow into those areas and programs that are desperately needed to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees. I see, following this course for many, many years, from replenishment to capitalization efforts, again to replenishments that may be weaker or stronger than the last ones, unless we provide a stable financing in public terms to this whole endeavor, I see actually that the speed that we have to actually achieve is going to be far, far too low. Second point for all of you, because the private sector is here, the public sector, don't forget about all the numbers about financing that is needed, that you also need people and societies that can actually live up to the challenge. So invest in education, skills and training, and employability. If you seize those opportunities, the narrative will be different. And I have to say, I participated in the ACS for a couple of weeks ago, and this is exactly that Africa, the story that Africa wants to tell. It's about employability, new jobs, and skills that can be created in Africa, really, to make the transformation happen. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ingrid. Excellent. So we are very, very grateful to Germany for continuing to contribute to climate action despite going through tough economic times yourself. We're also very grateful to you, Ingrid. You are a great executive director, and you've been a big friend to the bank. Thank you very, very much for that. But over to you, Nick. Anyway. But if you can keep your remarks to about 5 minutes, that would be...
Okay, I'll try to speak really quickly then. So first, thank you to the EMF, the Policy Centre. Thank you, Montek, for all your leadership and clarity and vision. And you show that a plausible, convincing narrative requires a sense of purpose and a vision, and to be convincing, it has to be founded on serious analysis. We can't separate vision, narrative, analysis. And you have been, over the years, such a big model for the rest of us. So thank you, Montek. Thank you to Amar Bhattacharya, who has been the source of so much of the analytical work, and it's Bhattacharya Songway Stern that Montek referred to. Homi Karas, also a very big part of that story. So thank you all. Now, what I want to say is largely in agreement with Montek, so what I'll be doing is lifting out and emphasizing largely in all this. The first thing is, and this is very much embodied in Montek's paper, is that you have to have a strategy which has a sense of purpose, which is delivery on Paris, and creating a new form of growth, much more attractive than the dirty, destructive models of the past. The strategy is that those two things together, delivery on Paris because we have to. If we don't, we're in deep, deep trouble, and that we can see in so doing this new model of growth is in our hands. That's the strategic story, and that's what gives you the investment numbers that we need to deliver on Paris. So what we're doing here is a deductive story. What do we need to deliver on Paris and launch this new growth story? And we have the investments by sector, by geography, and so on. That immediately creates, as Montek emphasized so well, the question of the conditions for investment. Is there an investment climate? Is there a country platform where investors can see where the economy is going, where they can tackle the investments that they need to, that they want to follow, that they can solve the problems that can arise? So the conditions for investment, and then the finance for investment. That's the logical structure. Strategy and investment, conditions for investment, finance. And that's what we've all tried to set out in the Bhattacharya Songway Stern work, in the G20 MDB work, and what's so clearly set out in Montek's paper. Let us never lose the sense of urgency. Michael Mann's new book, Our Fragile Moment, one of the great climate scientists, essentially says in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, starting now, we make the difference between some chance of 1.5 and more likely 3. On current policies, we look to be heading for 2.8 degrees or 3. The difference between 1.5 is hard, difficult, lots of adaptation to do. 3 is civilization destroying, fundamentally changing. Let's not sort of think, oh, well, we'll take our time, it's difficult, let's go slowly. Going slowly is the most dangerous, unrealistic thing of all. It takes us to somewhere near 3 degrees, and that is extraordinarily destructive. And we have to be very clear about the sense of urgency, and we have to be very clear about the deductive approach through investment, conditions for investment, and finance that we need to get there. Montek quite rightly laid great stress then, moving to the finance part of the story, on the 4 elements. Domestic resource mobilization, including private domestic resource mobilization, but of course the public finance is critical there. Moving to external private, the multilateral development banks, and then a whole range of concessional sources. You've got ODA, you've got the IDA monies, the SDRs, you've got philanthropy, you've got the voluntary carbon markets. The key thing is that that's low or zero cost money. So in rank order, those are the 4 things we need. Domestic resource mobilization, external private, MDBs, concessional. It's not just the sum, the total, that matters, although we need clarity on what those sums roughly might look like. It's the way they come together It's the blending of those stories. It's fundamentally managing risk, sharing risk, reducing risk to bring down the cost of capital so that in Africa, if you want to invest in solar powered electricity, you can get money at 6-7% when actually that's the cheapest form of electricity, cheaper than fossil fuels. But of course, if the cost of capital is 15 or 20%, then renewable electricity is not cheaper than fossil fuels. So this be very clear about how we blend these things together being absolutely critical. And it's not just a blending, it's of course the necessary conditions through public investment in grid structures, how that's going to work, because if that doesn't work, you're not going to get the private sector investment that is necessary in all this. So it's not just the totals, it's how they're blended together. The MDBs have a role to play, not just in providing the right source of finance, and in very different ways, as Montek correctly emphasized. They have a role to play in helping with country platforms investment climate as well. Now, finally, I've learnt from great public speakers that you start saying finally when you're about 2/3 of the way through, because it gives them hope. And so I've given you hope, but it is very close to the end of what I want to say. What I want to do is to emphasize why this is the growth story, because it's badly missed. You so often hear that there's some kind of horse race or spitting contest between growth on development on the one hand and climate responsibility on the other. That's a fundamental mistake. It's often founded on a suggestion that actually this climate stuff's not so bad after all. It gets close to climate denial because it's saying, look, we can slow down, we don't have to go so fast, it's all a bit difficult, but that in brackets there is the unsaid statement, actually it's not really that bad. So we have to be very careful and very clear that we have to put growth and climate together, and we can, and it's part of the inherent logic of the problem. Let me give you 6 sources of growth. First, the clean is cheaper than the dirty, and across at least 30% of the emissions. 6 or 7 years from now, that statement will be true across about 70% of the emissions. It's the area where the fastest innovation is taking place. So the first set of arguments is actually it's lower cost, it's where the innovation is happening. And the second part, and think that that innovation has come on not very good policy. Imagine how fast that innovation could be on much better policy. The second is a lot of these things have increasing returns to scale. The third is that a lot of this stuff is about resource efficiency, including energy efficiency, but resource efficiency. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. Fourthly, a lot of this is about changing systems, changing how our cities work, changing how our transport system works, importantly, changing how our agricultural systems work and how they all fit together. There's a big sources of productivity increase to unleash there. It is, of course, about an increased share of investment. We are talking about multiple percentage points increase in the investment share of GDP, more in poorer countries than in richer countries. And sixth, and crucial, this is about much better health. Just one aspect of that, air pollution kills something between 5 and 10 million people a year in a world where the total number of deaths in a year would be a bit upwards of 50 million. It's a very big part of the story. That doesn't count the maiming and injury that comes from air pollution. Of course, there are other health-related links. Health is surely critical in its own right, but health is also a big part of productivity. Six big reasons why this is the growth story. And let's remember, there isn't any other growth story. An attempt at high-carbon growth destroys itself. So we have to be very clear on the economics of all this. This is doing things in a very different way. It's fundamental change, but it gives ourselves something that's much more attractive than has gone before. And it is essential, because if we fail, we leave ourselves in a very, essentially our children and grandchildren in a situation that's almost impossible from the point of view of development and serious economic and social advance. So that's a vision that we have to carry with us, but it's an analytically deductive-based vision. It is what's necessary. I don't regard it as ambitious. To save yourself is not, it seems to me, ambitious. It's necessary, but it's much more positive than that. this is actually the growth story of the 21st century, and it's the only growth story of the 21st century. And as economists, we have to be very clear on that point because it's so often lost. Thank you.
So I couldn't summarize your intervention better than you did yourself in terms of the 6 propositions. So I'm going to turn to Rim, and Rim, because we are running out of time, you're going to be the one who's going to be squeezed a little bit. I want to make sure that Hasan also gets to speak. Yeah, so you can speak as long as Ingrid did.
Thank you very much, Indermit. So, first of all, I'm very delighted to be part of this panel along such distinguished experts. And I really enjoyed your presentation earlier, Montek, as it offered a very exhaustive framework that set the discussion for our panel. So, since we are discussing about climate change, I would like to share the experience of Morocco in terms of its energy transition. So I believe that Morocco has been forward-thinking in its approach to achieving net zero goals. So its efforts truly began back in 2009 with the implementation of its national energy strategy. And this has led to the development of renewable energies, particularly solar and wind, as part of a significant and very ambitious energy transition project. So since then, numerous achievements have been made so far. So today, renewable energy makes up, or rather renewable capacity makes up to 37% of the total installed capacity. And the share of renewable energy in terms of electricity generation has reached 20% in the latest years. And more recently, Morocco has undertaken a strong effort to create a new economic and industrial sector that is centered around green molecules, particularly green hydrogen. Now, despite this accomplishment, I think that the speed of our transition creates new challenges for us to tackle, particularly in terms of energy security, flexibility, as well as management of energy systems. Beside that, we also still need to find ways to overcome some economic, technical, and financial barriers in new industries like the green hydrogen. Now, the big question, especially for an emerging economy like Morocco, is how to finance this energy transition. Now, Morocco's expansion in solar power in the past decades illustrates the transformative role that concessional finance can play, especially when embedded with a systematic policy vision. So in the case of Morocco, the strategy included the creation of Mazen, which is a state-owned agency that is responsible for procuring large-scale renewable independent power producers, thus building on the procurement experience of Morocco's national utility. And if we go back to the mid-2000s, using solar power or solar energy for power was still expensive at that time. It is, of course, not the case now. And that despite of Morocco's having great access for solar resources. So without concessional financing, I think that scaling up solar energy would not have been truly possible or feasible, particularly due to its impact on consumer energy prices. Now, to overcome this, Morocco, along with the World Bank, collaborated to mobilize financing from the Clean Technology Fund on concessional terms, along with lendings from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And as a result, this has resulted in a 20% reduction in the tariff bid by the private sector or the private investors in the first solar public-private partnerships. And following this, the private industry subsequently invested in hundreds of megawatts of solar power generation in Morocco until now. Now, to further accelerate the energy transition, it is estimated that Morocco will require an extra $2.6 billion each year until 2030. And one thing it is clear, the role of government funding is important, but government alone cannot provide all the necessary funding. Instead, it should facilitate access to finance for businesses. So companies should take calculated financial and technological risks, with the private sector carrying the bulk of this investment. On the other hand, the main responsibilities for the government are to undertake the necessary structural reforms to facilitate the involvement of the private sectors in terms of reforming particularly the institutional framework and liberalizing and regulating key industries such as electricity. In this sense, an independent regulatory body must ensure an environment that supports both consumer protection, competitiveness, and growth in the private sector. Now, to conclude and perhaps move beyond Morocco to align with the topics of this forum, which is that of emerging markets, I think that a fair energy transition can only be achieved through massive changes and increases in both private and public financing. And of course, there is a big role to be played by multilateral development banks. And this shift necessitates collaborations between, of course, North-South, South-South, but also triangular alliances. And therefore, urgent attention is needed to guarantee a stronger cooperation between science, policy, and decision-making. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent presentation. Excellent. So this is an excellent way to bring this global issue to essentially a specific setting of Morocco. You could have talked more, but because you were saying these nice things about the EBRD and the World Bank. I'm sure Suma would have liked you to continue. But, but we have a really good speaker at the end. Now you have the last word, Hasan. Yeah, you can go there. And we're expecting Ngozi to come. So we may interrupt the question and answer session, but you can start. We will not interrupt you, Hasan.
Thank you very much. Just let me sort of say a couple of things to get out of the way. First of all, I think, Montek, your paper, the work that has been done by other papers, makes a very compelling case that the resource requirements are absolutely huge. We're talking trillions and trillions. Second point that comes out very clearly, at least to me, is that the reasonable availabilities fall woefully short of the requirements. Yeah? The third thing that comes through to me is that there is significant private savings, whether it's in the pensions, in insurance companies, in mutual funds, in various other domestic and international resources that are looking for long tenure money to match their liabilities that could and should be mobilized. And then fourth, I think there is no question, at least anymore, I hope there is no more question, that this has to be done urgently and it has to be done at scale. I mean, I think it's good, it's nice to say, you know, we've done this, we've done that, we have 5 billion here, 10 billion there. The numbers we're talking about is in the trillions. And, you know, the English will always have these wonderful sayings, better approximately right than precisely wrong, whether it's 3 trillion or 3.5 trillion or 4 trillion, we are really at a completely different scale. So, I mean, I think I want to mark that as a background. And my suggestion here is going to be that we not instead of, but in addition, as a matter of emphasis, we probably need to very quickly pivot toward how are we going to do this? Not only do we mobilize money, but how are we going to actually put this money together? You know, this packaging question that you put forth. How do we get from here to there? That requires a lot of impossible, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but we have to get going. We have to get going. We're talking about 2030. To get a good project going is going to take you 3, 4, 5 years to structure and then roll out. So 2030 is tomorrow. It's not out there. And as Montek rightly said, the area under that curve is the cost that we're incurring for humanity on the generation. So that, to me, is the background what I'm going to say. That all those issues are, to me, the important ones. So I'm going to make 3 suggestions here, 3 comments, and we can elaborate more. I mean, each of these are potentially quite rich. I mean, the first one is that one of the big constraints is we have to get, and Ingrid, you sort of touched on that, we have to get to a bankable, investable pipeline of projects. It is not good enough to say we have these urban needs, we have these energy needs. Well, where are the projects? And who is going to put these projects together? Yeah? To tee them up. The private sector, the investment and equity funds will do it themselves. They will, Nomura will have its own company to put it together. But that is bespoke and project by project. We need to really start thinking about how is this going to happen? Who's going to do the due diligence, the technical, the sequencing between policy, sector policy, and capacity, and local capital market development, et cetera, and putting that project together. It doesn't just happen. Somebody has to do it. And I'm not sure that we are collectively organized as yet to do it at the scale that this crisis deserves. Second, it occurred to me, and I was mentioning to others, this is an area, while it is so important, there are no standards. Every institution, private and public, does its own thing. And it's nice to have 1,000 flowers blossom, but if you don't have standards and data and metrics, you have no idea of what the impact is, and therefore you cannot harvest the knowledge and scale innovation. It's all over the map, and we don't know. And Philippe Leroux put together a very nice little think piece. There are 81 or so climate funds, and they're sprinkled all over the place. So we need to also, the institutional architecture of who's doing this needs to be brought into some level of sanity, so we can bring that together. Third, we need to really, I mean, within that context, also think about the country risk. The aggregate risk requirement and the aggregate availability of private and public funds may be manageable, but there are triple-B countries, and there's BB countries and B countries, and I can assure you, for those of you who are in the risk business, the kind of spreads you have to cover are enormous when you get to B countries in a B-minus country. And at that point, I think we all need to be conscious that we do not want to create an outcome that burdens the Treasury with a contingent liability. We don't want to burden them with debt, because that is not sustainable. We certainly don't want to have an offtake price that is so high that the consumer, the citizen, thinks this is an unfair distribution and covering of the cost. We cannot have that, because then the system will fall apart, and we know countries where there have been private services that were nationalized soon thereafter. And that has implications about seniority of debt. It has implications of how do we finance this thing, right? So this project pipeline, I think, is critical, and my recommendation is we got to get going now with some global standards and somebody who has the technical, global reach and the credibility to start setting these standards. It cannot be this kumbaya where you all get together and everybody does their thing. So maybe it's an MDB. Well, I won't go any further, but maybe there's a role for the MDBs for this. Second, I think, and it's a related challenge. And huh? You have to stop talking. Okay, I'll stop. He says. The second point I want to make is, and it's related, is the issue of scale. And we talk about these things, and we're very happy. I mean, GCF and GF, I mean, I've worked with some of them. The total book of GCF was something in the order of $15 or $20 billion. I mean, we're talking trillions here, 20 billion. It's a drop in the bucket. It's good, but we need to scale. And to scale, we need to move from bespoke project by project to a portfolio approach where we can actually securitize various tranches of the portfolio. And you can't securitize if you don't have standards. If the investor doesn't know what risk they are being asked to take. What are they buying here? And again, that mix of who does what in that portfolio is not immaterial. For clearly a lower non-investment grade country, that's going to be a very different risk profile and perhaps a higher mezzanine finance or a higher first loss facility. But a triple B minus, maybe that's a very different thing, right? So we have to get these things down, and I agree with what you said, perhaps a scalable template. Rather than template, I would say we need a disciplined, systematic, and structured approach where we work through these things country by country, asset class by asset class, brownfield, greenfield, risk-based, country-based, so we can see where do we need to mobilize what kind of finance. That today, to my knowledge, and I may not be on top of it, doesn't quite exist yet. It's very fragmented, and I think we do need to bring this thing together. You want to stop again, or you're sorry? The third thing I want to suggest is, before we get going on some of these things, we need to sort out internally, all of us collectively, a number of political economy questions. And what I have in mind is the following, that several of the most dynamic emerging economies are fast growing relatively, and they also tend to be very large emitters of GHGs. How are we going to deal with that? If there's a country that currently has a large coal, petroleum, and gas mix in their energy mix, how are we going to deal with them? Do we say we deal at the margin, we buy down their assets? And we need to think through that, not after the fact, but before the fact, so we can have a sense of what is the right transition. We look, Vietnam, I mean, it's not to point it out, but this is just the nature. I mean, coal investment, petroleum-based investment, gas investment has actually increased since the Paris Accords, hasn't decreased. And we need to recognize that and say, you have a series of assets that have a 20-year life. How do we deal with that? Do we just say freeze it and we will invest on the margin on the clean? Again, the under the curve question that Montek rightly pointed out still remains. So we need to figure that out before we go off and do that. So again, I think there's a role for perhaps the MDBs to do both the intellectual as well as the thing. And perhaps my last point, and this is more directed at the chairpersons of this illustrious forum, it may be time, rather than say the private sector shall, or the pension fund from Canada, or this, that, and the other will come. Why don't we have a panel or a group here, a day here, where we say, under what circumstances would you be willing to do this? So let's bring a rating company here. Let's bring some of the representatives from these large private entities, whether sovereign wealth funds or insurance companies, and say, here we have, under these circumstances, would you defer to the MDBs to set the standards? Will they have the trust and credibility that you would be willing to buy and securitize some of this portfolio? I think that would be, to me, hearing what they have to say, not accepting necessarily all of it, but hearing what they have to say so we can prepare ourselves and the countries to better take advantage of that. So my bottom line is it's a very compelling case, but let's move beyond mobilization only and get going with rapid and scale action so we can actually be there when 2030 happens and we can look back and say we have made a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hasan. Thank you. So we have, I just heard from Harinder that we actually, because we've been very good and we will still have about 5 to 10 minutes more, Harinder, for questions, or even more than that? More than that. So I thought what we'll do is, why don't we take 3 questions at a time, and then I'll turn to the panel and they can pick and choose the questions they want to answer. So we first go with Suma, and then you, and then over there, right? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
But keep your questions short, please, because we would like another round. Yeah.
Sure, it's going to be very short. I think it was an excellent presentation from Montek. Great comments from the panel. I associate myself fully with Hasan that we need to move from thinking not just about the finance quantum, but how on earth are we going to make this happen? One comment, I think on political economy, we need on carbon tax, which I agree with Montek about. In a democracy, you need to think long term. You need cross-party consensus on that sort of thing. It'd be amazing in the Indian election next year if both the main parties actually said this is not going to be a political football. One. Secondly, I think risk appetite of the MBBs. If I can talk to Gabriela about this, my experience is actually it varies enormously. EBRD is hugely risk-taking. In 5 years in North Africa, it had a bigger portfolio than IFC over 50 years. Why? Boots on the ground, much more risk appetite. By the way, municipal financing for 30 years, local currency financing, 40% of its loan book. Why is it that the other MDBs are not doing that? And it's the same shareholders. So they're not being pushed, I think, hard enough to do that. My final point really is a question, again, about are we willing to look at clean coal technology, for example, on the existing assets, at least to improve them so their emissions come down? And are we willing to allow MDBs to go into nuclear, new nuclear, not just maintenance, which EBRD used to do?
Yes. Almost everyone agreed that private sector is really critical for good scenario of development. But neither of you mentioned instruments which can be used. Nobody said anything about ESG, for example, abbreviation. Perhaps some other instrument can be used.
Yes, thank you so very much. I'm Mayu Avila. I come from Central America. I used to work in the banking sector, and I just want to share with you our latest regional initiative in leveraging private sector money and support to arriving to net zero. We established the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero in Latin America, which is gathering financial institutions. First is to increase the number of financial organizations with net zero commitments. And second, it's to encourage companies to establish commitments backed by robust objectives and transition plans. So my question is, where can we look for technical collaboration to accelerate the funding aligned to our net zero goals? I thoroughly enjoyed your panel's discussion. It was most helpful, and I encourage that you continue to put growth and climate together and publish your findings to guide us forward. Thank you.
We take two quick questions from Bobby and Anoop, and then I'm going to turn to the panel because I've been told that we have only 5 more minutes. Yep. Yes. Really quickly, Anoop, please.
The how. We need resources and we need to spend them correctly. In most countries, especially in federations, this is being done by the states and the provinces, both the pricing of energy and in terms of spending. Now, if a country like India or Brazil gets a lot of money, either from its own taxes or from abroad, from some loans, countries have not yet reached a stage. How are they going to direct this to their states or the provinces, and in what capacity and how? Until that is done, there's going to be a mess.
Bobby, and then I turn to the panel. We go first Reem, then then we go to Ingrid, and then we go to Hasan, and then Nick, and then finally Montek.
Hasan, if I understood you correctly, then you were, in a sense, fighting for a country-by-country appreciation of how to proceed with going to net zero, because there seems to be a tendency to give the impression that it's a one-size-fits-all type of a ballgame. When there are trade-offs between poverty and renewables, my experience is that introduction of renewables increases power rates for a period of time. So what are you going to do about that? You'll have poverty. There's a trade-off between capacity needed and renewables. Most of the time, you have to have hundreds of hectares of solar energy to produce 63 megawatts. And that's not enough to drive industrialization. there is a trade-off between land use and, again, renewables. How much agricultural land are you prepared to give up in order to put solar panels, wind generators, and so forth and so on? Thank you.
Good. So we have 5 minutes left, and we have 5 speakers here. So we go with Dream. You go first.
Thank you very much. So since we have only 5 minutes, I will be very brief. I would like to react on the question about the role of the private sector and the instruments such as ESG, and I agree that such instruments are very important to foster the contribution of the private sector. But I think that for a developing country like Morocco, it needs first to ensure some prerequisites to make sure that the private sector can operate. And this means clear regulations, sound institutional framework, ensuring competition as well, which is not usually the case in many developing countries. And it's not to say that the private sector has to do everything, but rather it's about how can it help. And again, I go back to the point that was mentioned by Montek, also in his presentation, and my points before, the need for structural reforms. And here I go back to my points on regulations, because we need a regulation that prioritizes economic efficiency and has the ability to adapt to varying level of competition and market maturity, which can, in fine, allow the private sector to also operate and work hand in hand with the public sector in order to advance our efforts in terms of the energy transition.
Excellent. Ingrid, you take whichever question you want.
I would like to react to the question raised about the reconciliation between decarbonization, the growth story, and the change that has to happen. In principle, I would really absolutely concur with Nicholas Stern that the climate decarbonization story can be a growth story and a story about opportunities. But the transition to that stage is really complex, and it's very difficult. And I think we shouldn't simply be naive about the political costs that can come along with it, quite frankly. Therefore, I think it's so important that we forge partnerships that deal with the just transition. What does it take? So what kind of impact a certain policy may have on terrorists, on certain populations, on communities? But there are ways really to address this, and this has to be part of the package. When we speak here about packages in order to transition to a carbon-free society and economy, I think we have to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind. And this has to be figured out what this is exactly. And this is different in South Africa, when we forge a just transition package from Indonesia or from India, for sure. But for me, this has to be part of it. Multi-stakeholder platforms, bringing the private sector in, creating the right narratives, and we need huge communication strategies that go along with it. Unless we do so, and quite frankly, I come from Germany, you read the newspaper as well, it's going to be a very, very difficult story to stay on path.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think Bobby's point is yes. Projects, investments take place in countries, locally or nationally. So yes, we have to have, obviously, the domestic content and context in mind. But that is not at odds with then the need to bundle these things so we can securitize them and leverage them. So that my point is that you need the entry point in the countries, but then you need the standards and the data that allow you to be able to bundle these in ways that become placeable in various long-term investors' portfolios. That was my point.
Excellent. Nick, and then we give the last word to Montek.
Thank you. Centre, lower levels have to come together, and so much of the action is indeed at lower levels. That's a yes. Clean coal is no. It's an oxymoron unless it's got carbon capture and storage, and that's just much too expensive. You know, renewables are far cheaper than coal with carbon capture. New forms of revenue, yes. I think India's model, where 2% of net profits are supposed to go to ESG, is a very good one that could be followed in other countries, could be followed by places where whether or not it's a rule, it could be voluntary as well. lots of revenue availability from the very bad subsidies that we see in many places, particularly in agriculture. Great work by the World Bank on toxic subsidies there. That's a real source of revenue and stopping of harm at the same time. Taxing maritime came up strongly in the Paris summit called by Macron. Again, I think that's very valuable. Of course, there are tough choices in all this, but the most impractical, the most unrealistic response to those tough choices is delay. And we have to be very clear on that. Delay is dangerous, it's unrealistic, it is the opposite of practicality. Finally, yes, indeed, the just transition will look different in different places, and that is something, of course, the judgment on that is led by the country that's doing the transition, not necessarily by an outsider.
Montek, you have the last word.
You're overshot, so...
No. It's absolutely right to be.
Well, no...
So I've been made to... I have been made to wait by Ngozi many, many times. I can make her wait today. Yeah.
No, no, thanks. Actually, I thought the point that Anup, he's disappeared, no, he's still there. That the whole, at least looking at it from the Indian context, a lot of this will require very close coordination between the central government and the state government. I mean, certainly as far as the power sector is concerned, jurisdictionally, distribution is in the hands of state government. Certainly when it comes to public transport, how do you organize, move from private to public transport, virtually all the decisions have to be taken by state governments. Now, my hope is that actually what will happen is any effort to lay down a standard way of doing things isn't going to work. But I think if you allow a lot of experimentation to take place, hopefully some state governments will do better than others. And I think they ought to learn from each other. The other thing is that across countries, we need, and something that maybe the World Bank can do, you need to put across what are the success stories that we should learn from. Because we're going through a transition and transformation of a kind that we've not seen before. And I think in the past, as long as it's not strictly linked to loan-related conditionality, the willingness to learn will be there. And it's a huge job for all the multilateral development banks, the Asian Development Bank, spreading across the lessons of the transition in Asia. And indeed, the EMF should do the same thing in subsequent meetings to find out what is working in different countries and what is not.
Well said. So I have taken notes about all the things that you mentioned, and I'm going to carry them back. Maybe next time when we meet, I'll have progress on that one about actual success stories. But for now, thank you immensely to all of the panelists and for your questions. I would just like you to give them back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, moderator Indermit, Gill, and panel. You may now leave the stage after the photo.